I was aware that incentives can shape behaviors, incentives can shape how motivated people can be. But in startups, it's very different in the beginning. You essentially are trying to recruit people who could start their own businesses. And hence, it can't be about making a little bit more money. Incentive structure sometimes comes in the form of allowing people to be co-creators of a vision. It can come in the form of being co-creators of values of a business. How do you run it? And creating that ownership. So it really is about ownership, if you think about it.
This episode feels like it revolves around pivotal moments in your life and taking bold bets. Abbey from Circles is just one of those people that takes these answers and reflections in their stride, which is incredible when you consider he landed in Singapore when he was 15 and only some years later, with his co-founders, took the leap to disrupt the gargantuan telco industry. With considerable success, mind you. This episode has it all, from how to select your co-founders, how to think about competitors, what to look for in early hires, and how to decide when international expansion is right. There are so many nuggets of advice. This one is a must-watch. Enjoy.
Abbey, welcome to the first podcast.
Welcome.
Thank you.
So I think people listening to this who haven't heard of Circles Life or yourself probably have been living under a rock for the last 10 years. But for those people that do not know, can you maybe explain a bit about Circles Life and a bit about yourself real quickly?
Sure. So Circles is the world's first digital telco. We founded the business in Singapore in 2014, and the idea was to give power back to customers. Everyone suffers with their telcos when it comes to customer service, whether that's buying a price plan, paying bills. eSIMs is a problem now. And the idea was to liberate customers around the world when it comes to the pain that telcos provide them. We have since expanded from Singapore to many markets in the world. We are currently in more than 8 markets directly. We are in Australia, Taiwan, Japan, in the Middle East, and you'll hear about some of these things shortly. Actually, around the time of this publishing, I think we should see something. I personally founded the business together with two co-founders. Before that, I was a private equity investor, invested in Indonesia, largely Asia actually. And before that, management consultant. I'm a Singaporean, and I moved to Singapore when I was relatively young. So, my introduction can go on for really long. So I'm probably going to stop here.
Maybe we can start with that early upbringing. So you'd obviously moved to Singapore, I think, 14, 15, around that age?
15.
15?
Yeah.
And you had early aspirations of being an actor, from what I believe.
Oh my God, you found that?
Yeah. So maybe just expand more for the audience, just that early upbringing and what led you to Singapore.
So actually, the story began when I was 4 years old. I was 4. I was watching, and we come from a middle class background in India, and middle class in India really means poor, really. We were watching the Wimbledon final on this really small black and white TV screen. And Boris Becker was playing tennis. He's 16 years old in the final, right?
Yeah.
One of the youngest to ever make it. And the guy is jumping around the court, and I'm watching it. And my father says, "Do you want to play in the Wimbledon?" And, I'm like, I'm 4 now. I can understand, stop taking the piss out of me. And he's like, "No, what are you talking about? This guy's 16. If he can make it, so can you." And I remember telling him, "What are you saying? I have not seen a tennis court." And then he narrated the story of how different people have kind of made it in life without really much. And that was kind of the first opening of the mind, if you will. And the main point was, you could stop at, one should dream big. That could be the takeaway. But really the takeaway was something else. The takeaway was, don't let any frameworks get in the way of what you want to do. First principle thinking matters much more than any frameworks. And once that thing opened up, then it was purely about what sounds exciting. And for a young kid, it was about acting. You see someone on TV and, it looks good. So I joined an acting school. And realized very soon that I was average at best. I thought I was good looking, but I was very promptly, I was pointed out by the director that maybe you should not be the lead actor. The guy who's a foot taller, maybe should do that. But that first principle thinking stayed with us. And I could have stayed in India, but Singapore government invited some of us to come over, and I was fortunate enough to do that. It felt like a complete change. Um, and the idea was to go experience something completely different, to come to Singapore. So that's where the journey really began, actually, to come to Singapore. Yeah, it's been a dream, to be honest.
And had you traveled much outside of India at that point, or was this really your first exposure into Southeast Asia and Singapore specifically? What was that transition like?
We considered traveling overseas, but it was a question of, do you donate your liver or your kidney? And so we couldn't travel overseas. And this was my first time ever on a plane, actually. It's the first time ever
Right.
sat down in a plane. Did not know how to close this, the seat buckle and all of that, So this was my first foray into this. And it was really a choice between a very anglicized school in Singapore or Hua Chong, where I went, which is a very Chinese school. And the whole point was, since you are diving into the pool and you don't know how to swim, what difference does it make if it's a deeper pool or not? So just dived into the deep end, joined the Chinese junior college, and frankly learned so much about the local culture, about how people think, made me question a lot of my assumptions about life. Frankly, was quite a learning experience. Still stays with me till today.
And you made the decision to go on to tertiary education here. Was that just simple and straightforward? You felt at home increasingly in Singapore, or you thought about other markets and then decided to study locally here?
I did consider going overseas. Back in the day, Singapore government did give out scholarships.
Yep.
To go overseas, but I think it required you to become a Singaporean. And everyone, from my uncles, aunts, and people come out of the woodwork to give you advice. And many people did, and they said, "Listen, take the Singapore citizenship. What's your problem? Just take a scholarship, go overseas." It just felt not real. It just felt like a sellout kind of a situation. And I'm quite emotional that way. Like I only want to do things that I believe in. And it just makes it easier to do anything for that matter, right? So I decided not to go overseas, continue studying in Singapore, which did not require me to change my citizenship. Funnily enough, after I studied here for a bit, I felt like maybe this is home. And the realization came when I traveled back to India, I think to do one of my first few jobs. I'm like, this feels different than
Right.
what I think, the values of Singapore, meritocracy, doing the right thing, your destiny not being determined at birth, which kind of ties into the whole thing that my father was talking about, interestingly. So the values really resonated, actually, when it came to Singapore. So yeah, I could have gone overseas. So I'm just going around in a tangent here. But the point is, I could have gone overseas, but decided to stay. And I think it was based on that principle, that decision.
So, I mean, we'll unpack the story post-school. But first, was there any inclination or bug of being a founder? Or was there any reference to that when you were going through school or university, that was something that you might aspire to be at a later stage in life?
That's such a good question, by the way, because in that moment back then, I did not think I ever wanted to be a founder, ever, actually. And interestingly, when I look back now, I feel like there were so many things that were preparing me for this journey. Going to a non-anglicized school, you might say, just diving into the deep end, not being afraid of failure or being taught to think big, first principles thing. I think some of those things were probably preparing me for this moment, but I definitely did not want to be a founder. Actually, that was not in the realms of possibilities. It's almost a new thing if you think about it, right? Till the year 2007-8, you used to hear about some guy in Silicon Valley did something, but over here, a big company was Singapore Airlines or DBS.
Yep.
Or, that was you could say, the framework of what success looked like. You might become an investment banker. You might be one of those people who invest some money, something in finance, but you don't even know what. But founder, no, it wasn't actually.
And so, obviously post-university, you moved into more of a corporate trajectory. Do you want to maybe talk through the reasoning for that and that pathway?
Yeah, so I was studying engineering and I did a minor in business. And I actually enjoyed the business courses more, but I did not have depth because it's a minor. And I felt like I should do something that does not tie me down so quickly, something that gives me broader exposure, and consulting was that. So that's why I joined consulting, started looking at companies there, usually Fortune 500 companies, their challenges, try to help them as much as I could. Of course, guided by people who had done it for 20 years. And there's a lot that I learned there. So that was the choice that was made to go into consulting, kind of broaden it out a little bit and then narrow it from there. So that was the first one. And then from there, I went into investing, which I really enjoyed. As I advised some of my clients on their investing choices, although just a small part of the investing choice, to be honest, but it gave me a good exposure. So I went into that. That was the next one, yeah.
We hear about folks that have been in, founders that have been in consulting, and you hear sort of mixed reviews. Some people say it was something I realized very quickly that I wanted to get out of and it was going to constrain my thinking, and others that say, no, this was formative for me and it became so critical to developing a toolkit. What end of the spectrum would you say you're on in that respect in terms of the value it gave you ultimately then becoming a founder?
I think, firstly, the answer to that question for different founders is also dependent on when you ask them. You know, people who joined consulting now versus 15 years ago when there was not much of a, you did not have the startup ecosystem. So I think that's just the broader kind of the backdrop. For me personally, I felt like consulting really helped me. It was a great experience. I got to meet people from all parts of the world. There was a strong focus on solving complex problems in a first principle manner. So it kind of goes back to that. First principle problem solving was huge. The second thing was, so staying with the first one, first principle problem solving is something that I think is key for being a good founder in my view, because the problems that get thrown your way are not the kind of things you can read about in a book. You just have to apply yourself on the spot. And I really enjoyed that. So I think that was one. The second was, as a 22-year-old, having studied in NTU with a team full of Harvard Business School grads and some of those guys, and advising a Fortune 500 CEO, you can really go two ways. I think you can either feel like you don't belong and crumble under that, or the people around you can play the role of really propping you up to say, you can do this and you've got it, and it can build a lot of confidence. So I think that second piece was actually, that's how it turned out for me. I was really lucky to have great mentors, people who were ready to encourage me. And there's a strong culture, which is linked to the second point in consulting, which is around feedback. Strong feedback culture, and it's designed around not taking it personally. And I remember there's a thing we used to say at McKinsey. We said feedback is a gift. And if you see it that way, then every piece of feedback, even this conversation, how you might react to it, actually is a great learning. It puts you in the mindset of wanting to constantly learn. And as you aim for big things, if they are big enough, going back to my childhood story, if they are big enough, you will fail. And as you fail, that feedback will allow you to learn as opposed to crush you. So I think that fundamental value, that fundamental way of thinking about things is something that consulting really brought to the fore. And it's been ingrained in me and most of the organizations I've built.
I don't think I've ever heard anyone speak that passionately about consulting. That was amazing. And so obviously you didn't stay in consulting, so you moved into private equity. Do you want to talk about that transition?
Absolutely. I think that was a different kind of learning. The truth is consulting stops, if you will, at the EBITDA line very often. Revenue growth, cost cutting, whatever that might be. And sure, there are different kind of things consultants do, but owning a business is a very different thing. When you put a few $100 million into a company and you own a big chunk of it and it goes sideways, it's not about a consulting project kind of gone a little bit the wrong way and, the next consulting project begins. There may not be anything else after this,
Yep.
So you own the business effectively as a private equity player. The decision making around it. And you start to see all aspects of it. How do people think about money? How do they think about raising capital? How do they think about spending it? How do they project things out 2-3 years into the future? And there's a huge human element to it. Do you trust a CEO or a founder to do the right thing? Not because they are not capable, but sometimes their mental makeup is a certain way. All of those different things are really about owning a business end to end. And until you become a founder, you really don't get that kind of experience because you're kind of on the sidelines in some role or the other in a company. This was the closest one could be to being a founder. So in that sense, I think I learned a lot. It was not easy actually because having not studied finance, and consulting was not about finance, to learn all of that very quickly. But I'm so grateful it happened.
And I imagine, one of the things we talk about a lot is through that lens, looking at incentives. You touched on the human element of it, but when you majority own or significant minority investor in a business, I think what you start to also observe is the power of incentives, how that drives performance and productivity and, the company's overall performance. What did you take away from that? How did that inform, I guess, when you started, you sort of found a cycle, the importance of incentives and how to align people? Because I think that's something that we talk about a lot.
Yeah, I think on that, private equity might not have been as effective a coach as the first few interactions with VCs was, to be honest.
Right.
Because private equity usually comes in at a later stage, and it can feel very corporate in some ways versus the decisions at the start of the business are very different, in my experience. By the time PE comes in, you have a well-formed management team, and you say, all right, if you go from 100 to 200, you all make 5 out of this, or 10 out of this, or whatever that might be. So in that sense, it was I was aware that incentives can shape behaviors, incentives can shape how motivated people can be. But in startups, it's very different in the beginning. You essentially are trying to recruit people who could start their own businesses. And hence, it can't be about making a little bit more money. Incentive structure sometimes comes in the form of allowing people to be co-creators of a vision. It can come in the form of being co-creators of values of a business. How do you run it? And creating that ownership. So it really is about ownership, if you think about it. So incentives are people linked to ownership, and as the company gets older, people link ownership to shareholding. But if you really get into the ownership, what ownership really means is ownership of an idea, ownership of a concept, ownership of the way of doing things. And people tend to value that much more.
So when was it, when you were in the buy side, that you started to think about the decision to want to go be a founder, to start something yourself?
This was in Indonesia, actually. When I was at Bain Capital, we were doing much bigger deals. Each deal was like $1 billion, and you'd meet third-generation founders.
Yep.
Then I moved to Indonesia, and I was looking at deals which were $50 million deals, $70 million deals, and you'd meet founders who were in their mid-30s. They came from backgrounds similar to mine, right? Middle class, and they were not fortunate enough with education or the kind of upbringing around, the McKinseys and Bain Capitals. And they were doing it. They were creating impact, creating jobs. So suddenly it felt like it was possible. So that's the first time I felt like it is possible to do something like this. And so I think that was a moment where it felt like now is the moment. I can do it. If you ask them how they started, they had all sorts of stories. Like I met this gentleman who runs one of the biggest mosquito repellent businesses in Indonesia.
Right.
And I met him, and I met him at his place in Sentosa. He has 4 places in Sentosa. And he brought me to one of those, and he started to serve me tea, and I had no idea who he was. And he started to clean the table. I'm like, you're a billionaire. He's like, yeah. Did you know how I started? Showed me pictures. He mixed the repellent liquid by himself the first few times, and he showed me pictures. I'm like, wow, this is how it's done. And that's when it became very clear that it is possible, number one. Number two, the whole corporate image of I'm going to show up in a suit and I'm going to give advice and stay far away and someone else does it, I think that also went away. To say, this is what it takes. It's down in the dirt. You have to get your hands dirty. And it feels like this for 10 years, 15 years.
Let's talk about the comfort levels of taking that leap. So there's that line about like people that are in big tech or they're in corporate life and then jump into being a founder. But it takes that kind of conviction or passion to make that leap because things can be quite comfortable in those careers. You could see yourself there for 10, 15 years. Was there certain things, I guess, that you needed to tick before you kind of made that leap, whether it was personal or professional?
Yeah, I think personally the question I asked myself was, the finance career, does that lead to any of the following 3 outcomes? Am I doing, for example, something really great for society? And the answer was not quite. I mean, it's okay, but nothing too special. Am I doing something really special for my family in the sense, you could be doing a job which is, you come home at 5 and you spend time with your kids or your wife or whatever. No, I don't think that was a life. And the third was, is it going to lead to creating a platform that then allows me to do great things? And it felt like maybe when I'm 50, and if I survive till 50 at those kind of hours. So I think personally that was kind of the mental map I went through. And professionally, I think it was important to actually work with people I trusted in and believed in. So my co-founders are people who I have great respect for. Hardworking gentlemen. They have they've gone through similar journeys. I think trust was an important factor there, and trust in their abilities, but trust in their intentions. I think both of those had to come together. So that gave me a fair bit of confidence to say, now we could do something.
How do you think through founder composition in those early days? Because we talk to a lot of founders on this podcast, and there's stories of founders where they get their mates from school together and they create something amazing, right? But there's also stories where that happens and it doesn't work out. There's stories where they source people from events that cover their blind sides, right? How do you think through that? And how did you approach that with Circles?
There wasn't much of a framework, frankly. It was just like, do you trust two people and we'll figure it out, really. And I actually think that's the right model. I think trust has to be the foundation for any, for someone like me, has to be the right foundation for a start, because the journeys are so tumultuous and so many things happen that if you do it purely on the basis of, I have a tech founder, I'm the business guy, or I'm the business development guy and someone else does this, the truth is, these things change. And eventually, if you are doing a good job, you should hire people who are much better than you on those things anyway. So should it really be based on functional things? Maybe to jumpstart, to kickstart the thing, maybe. But very soon, it becomes futile, actually, in my view. So I think first step is trust.
Do you think it's necessary to have a founder, to have more than one?
I think it's necessary to have a system where you have a way to get feedback and you have a way to actually not get into tunnel vision.
Yep.
Let me take you back a few years after getting to Singapore, and I remember having this feeling of, I must be great. And I know this is laughable. I don't know why I even thought that, and I think I didn't work very hard in my junior college, and these are kids. They pick 20 kids out of India, and all of them score great grades, go to Cambridge or whatever. And I think I almost failed. And the scholarship officer was like, "What has happened to this guy?" And the biggest difference there, as I've now analyzed over the years many, many times, is lack of mentorship or not being able to find mentors or people whose advice I listen to.
Mm.
And I think the important thing in these businesses or any endeavor which is meaningful is to find a way to create that mechanism. And that requires empowering people. And that empowerment comes through a structure of co-founders, because then you're designed like that, but it doesn't have to be. So I think the important thing is to have a mechanism to not be in tunnel vision, to have people who also believe in this, because it takes a village to make it happen. Whether you call them co-founders, you call them advisors, you call them anything you want. That's, sorry, a little bit of a different way
like
to
that.
answer.
Works.
No, I like that. Yeah.
Let's gear shift to bold bets. And I've heard you say before that you like to challenge the status quo. And if you think about telco, it's a gargantuan industry, nearly intimidating to look at in terms of trying to break it up or found something within it right now or change it. Why did you lock in on telco as an industry that you wanted to disrupt?
This is going to be the most uninspiring answer I'm going to give you, by the way. So here I was sitting with my co-founder, Ramiz, one day. We're having a glass of whiskey. Like, dude, which industry should we do? And he's like, we were exploring telco at that point. And, coming from financial services, I'm like, we could also do a bank. And this is not going to sound exciting now, but back then there were no neobanks. This is pre-new bank days.
Yep.
So this whole thing we're trying to do with telcos could also be done for banks. And we thought about it for a little bit. We said, yeah, maybe it requires more capital. And we've done more work with telco, let's do telco. So it was, I would love to say that that's how we landed on it. But one of the reasons why we even had telco in the mix is because one of my brightest memories from childhood is someone brought me this little box and said, pick it up. And on the other side was, I think it was my grandfather. I'm like, this can't be real. Like, this is not connected to anything. And I just that was a moment in which, the power of connectivity became real for me. I still feel there's a long journey ahead, and people have become complacent in the industry. So it felt like a big enough space. It had to be big. It had to be something that creates impact. It had to connect to me. So I think those were some of the factors.
Before we start digging into Circle's life, I think there's a bit of a funny story around the origination of the name. Do you want to expand on that?
Oh man, you have really researched
Thank
this.
you.
So we started with this whole thing around telcos have held us in a jail, and you have these contracts which are 2 years long. They really are 2 years long. You travel overseas and suddenly you pay $100. Like you pick up a phone call. Let's just say someone calls you back in the days. You don't know whether to pick it up or not. If it's your mom calling and something bad has happened, then you would regret not picking it up. So you pick it up, you put it down. In that time, you'd pay $100. So it just felt like a jail. And we said, okay, this should be called something. What should we call it? Let's call it Liberty. Liberty from telcos. So Liberty private, Liberty Wireless is what we called it. And turned out there's a big company called Liberty, which does telecommunications, which we did not know about. So here we are, a bunch of guys in a room smaller than this, and trying to do stuff in Liberty. And next thing you know, Nokia's head of the region, Ericsson's head of the region, everyone's reaching out to us, really want to meet you. We're like, who says this startup thing is hard? You set up your company and people show up. And they're like, oh, you really want to work with Liberty? You're like, oh, great. Yeah, we also want to work with you. And little did they know that we are not the same guys. But when it came to launching the business, look, I think by that time, we had someone who was much better than us at marketing and branding. And they said, listen, you must have been born in early 80s. He said, yeah. So let's call it something more exciting. Let's call it. So we came up with Circles. Yeah.
Do you remember day one? Do you remember the day one of Circles?
Of the company or the launch?
The company.
The company. Yeah, I do remember that, actually. I do remember. This is just the three of us. We met at, Boontonki on River Valley, right? So they served some roti prata, and I remember I had gone for a jog. It was really sweaty, and these guys were like, let's talk about telco. And I was like, why telco? I mean, come on, if you are going to do this, let's do something else. But, spoke to them, and it's like, oh, telco looks interesting. Yeah, I still remember that day quite vividly, actually. Like
That's
it was
awesome.
yesterday. Yeah.
So Circles is born. What's the first, order of effect? Like, what are you focused on first? Is it fundraising, speaking to customers, building a product?
I think the first was we first wanted to make an app. So we had a bit of a journey, by the way, to getting to where we are today. We started by saying, listen, whenever you want to call overseas, it's very expensive to do that. So there should be some way to make a phone call without paying the telcos, which was 1 year into our journey replaced by WhatsApp, and the business model went to zero, by the way, very, very quickly. So we started with that first. So to create a product. So I think to answer your question more directly, the thinking was always create a product that customers would love, and everything else will follow. Of course, you need some capital, but I think we raised our first $1.5 million in the first 5-6 days, really. That's how quickly it came in. Again, very lucky, which is why I think the start felt lucky. People we had worked with before, they all said, whatever you're doing, we'll put money. So capital was not a challenge. I think building a product was a challenge. And landing on something people care about was a challenge. So that was kind of the first order. And then to do that, since none of us were techies, it was about recruiting the first few engineers, which is a story in itself. But yes.
I think let's get to that for sure, because I want to unpack that a little bit more. Were there any reservations or worries in that first, call it 6 months? You're like, oh my God, like what have I done? Like we don't know how to build product. We don't have engineers. I miss consulting.
It's funny. Actually, we must have been really naive because that thought never crossed our minds. It was like, of course we will succeed. There's a little bit of that naivety around that. Of course we'll be fine. And looking back, I think we should have been less confident, to be honest. I remember getting to my last $20,000, was it? Last US $14,000-15,000. And still feeling like there was too much money in the bank. What's the problem? Like, of course we'll succeed. Like, it's crazy, really. But I think it's a good thing to have that naivety because then you're fearless and you're just doing stuff.
How did you think through competitors at that time? Like, obviously, you had, like I said before, the gargantuan telco industry with these kind of mature players. Did you think a lot about that? Because, I kind of think about like Jeff Bezos and Amazon and, doesn't think about competitors, thinks about customers and that whole mantra.
Yeah.
What did you guys think of that industry at the time and what you were up against?
I think we were forced to think about competitors a little bit. And the reason is the model that we landed on, which is to give customers a SIM card with which they can, make phone calls, voice, data, SMS, and all of that. That core business was being done by someone else, unlike, say, some folks who started a completely different thing, like Jeff Bezos for that matter. And hence, it was important to keep in mind what they were building, or what they had, or what their roadmap looked like, and to be so far ahead of them that they couldn't possibly catch up. And our model for that was to launch everything digitally, from customer service to how this is sold and everything.
How did you think about the concept of product market fit? I mean, it's a complex industry that you're operating in. I'm sure there was a lot of build that had to happen before you kind of really got to a level of product you were happy with.
Yeah.
When were you going to sort of say, hey, or when did you find product market fit?
I think the first step before finding it is to have clarity on what you're going after. And
Yep.
very often, I think the market piece of it and matching the product to it is where I think a lot of the times people can go wrong. And if we approached it like traditional telcos, we'd want to go after everybody. But we instead were quite sure we wanted to be a very narrow sliver of the market. And we knew that if we serve that narrow sliver very, very well, or hyper serve them, if you will, then other good things will come. So I think the first step was to define that market, and we went after digital native customers, people who'd be willing to pay an extra dollar for an Uber versus a cab, just for the convenience. Just they can do it on the app. People who would pay for a Netflix versus, find some other way to watch a movie, for example. And that meant that we could really finally define that segment down to it being a very small part of the market. And when we launched the product, out of those customers that became free every month, because they were all stuck on these 2 year, the 2 year jail that I mentioned. So only about 2% of them would get released every month. If you were getting a big enough chunk of that, that means our product makes sense. So we didn't need to wait for a long period of time to say, now we've hit product market fit, because now we have $10 million revenue or whatever. As long as we're hitting that share of the market that becomes available, boom, now we can spend more on marketing. Now we can raise more money. So that was kind of the logic that we landed with.
Do you want to talk maybe about the product evolution of Circles? Because there's obviously a large data component to this as well, right? Which I think listeners will be definitely interested to hear.
Yeah. We started off with the telco piece, but really the vision was to serve these customers really well. And telcos, frankly, have more information on a customer than maybe Google or Facebook would have today. Just, too much. And it was not being used to serve the customers. So the idea was to put it all together and give them personalized services, which may be around, say, insurance. If you're carrying your phone, you're driving, and the speed limit there is 60, but you're going at 70, your car company today might know, but back in the day, they did not know that. Or your insurance company definitely doesn't know. But if you're driving at 70 on the same road and an equivalent person to you is driving at 59, the person driving at 59 should pay a lower premium than you should. And of course, we're not going after the one who drives at 70 in this case, clearly. But the one who drives slower probably should pay less and should maybe have, there may be other services you can provide to them. That's just one example, by the way. You could have geofence services. You're passing in front of a Starbucks and you're a coffee bean drinker. Starbucks probably spends $50 to acquire you. It probably serves better coffee in some cases not, but perhaps. And if you were to bring that customer to Starbucks, customer gets a free coffee. Starbucks pays for it. They pay us for bringing the customer in, and there could be a conversion rate that makes it cheaper for Starbucks to acquire. Customer is happy, we are happy, everyone's happy. So, these are kind of the examples we thought of. And we did a fair bit of this, tried a little bit of this in Singapore, and then, of course, COVID hit, and that was... But that was the second kind of pit stop. And the third pit stop was to take it more international. And the idea was, once you built it for Singapore, and clearly customers love it, our net promoter score was positive 50. in a market where telcos had a -10 net promoter score, like negative. So that means it works, but is it a Singapore specific thing? So that was the third pit stop. We went to Australia and we went to Taiwan with it. We found more success in Australia. And post that, of course, now we've launched a SaaS business, which is doing really well.
I actually want to unpack that a bit more because one of my questions to you was going to be around that whole market expansion and what were the indicators to make you want to move into other territories. NPS is such an interesting one, so I love that. I guess were there other kind of pull factors as well on top of that? And I guess the other question is why Taiwan and why Australia?
Yeah. Let me start with the last question because I think it kind of feeds into the other ones. We needed markets that had good quality data. And 4G data was quite ubiquitous in Taiwan and Australia. Smartphone penetration was high. Customer satisfaction was low. And these just felt like the good ingredients for us to go in. And you want to go in a market where there is revenue to be made. If the ARPU, average revenue per user, is $2, which is for most of Asia, used to be at least, you really can't make too much money easily. So those are the factors for choosing those markets. But it went back to the original mantra with which we founded Circles, which was to help customers around the world, empower customers to break the shackles from the telcos worldwide. So it was purely a question of how we might do it. We were inspired by the likes of Uber, by the likes of Netflix, and it felt like we could do it that way. So that was the thought process behind wanting to expand internationally. Because Singapore, sure, we hit about 5-6% market share. And at that point, it was diminishing returns. We could expand to other segments of the market, but we were hyper-serving that segment, which existed worldwide. And really, if you think about it, that segment is a global thing. It's one might say a digital savvy customer in New York does not look too different from a digital savvy customer in Jakarta. I mean, that's quite phenomenal, isn't it? So we said, let's ride that wave.
Awesome. And obviously to make this happen, you need exceptional people and talent. When I was doing my background research, I've heard you talk very passionately about people in Circles. And how did you think about establishing a culture in those early days for Circles, and what did you look for in early hires as well?
So I think firstly, culture is a constant journey. It's a journey you live throughout the business and actually beyond. It's not just something you're doing as a part of getting something done. And I think that's a fundamental thing that all the founders aligned on. We are aligned on values as well. And it's a process to align on values as founders because everyone brings their own color, their own kind of flavor to the thing. And the whole piece about becoming co-founders is also merging some of those values and aligning on them. So I think we landed on some of those. And we had values around ownership, around learning, around it's important to around hierarchy, around being bold. And some of these values we thought quite hard about. Why do we believe in them? Why do we think it's important to run a business that way? And once that was clear, we looked for people who could actually align with us on most of those values, if not all, and had examples from their lives where they really lived those values. As the business actually grew, I think it was harder to control some of that. And if I have any regret about it, it would simply be that I wish we were actually more steadfast with that. We're a little bit more strict with that. Because when you're growing very, very quickly, these things can actually go sideways. And you can say, you know what, I need these 20 engineers. I need these 10 people in this country. 7 of them align with the values. We need to launch in a week or we need to do something. What do? You know, the easy answer, actually a very, very tough answer is to say, let's take the 10 and we'll find a way to mold the 3. From my experience, that molding, you forget and the team forgets, and it's a small cancer that suddenly grows and becomes big. So values was very, very important. So number 1. Number 2, we made it a point to have some way to regularly communicate with the team regardless of where they were, So every Monday we would have all hands where we discuss what's going on, what's working, what's not working, and not in a way that a founder owns it or not. Everyone's an equal in that meeting. And that was very important. That was number 2. Number 3, it was very critical for us that we get together as friends, the entire team. So every Wednesday, especially in the beginning, when we were just 10 to 15 people, one of us in the team would cook for everybody. And it was really like, it was quite an exercise. Whoever had to cook, they would leave a little bit early on Tuesday, and we'd cook and they'd bring the food. And we were all from different parts of the world. There was a person from Belarus, there was someone from Philippines, we had someone from Slovakia, we had, so people from all parts of the world. It just became like a great way to get to know each other. And why do you like what you like? So it was a great bonding thing. And through that, more alignment on culture actually happened. And as we grew, we made it a part of our evaluation criteria. Alignment with culture was at least 30% of the score for the year as we grew much bigger. And you could have scored the entire 70% on the remaining part, which is the functional stuff. But if this does not align, the answer was very clear that we have to figure out why that's happening. And if that means one has to be counseled to find opportunities elsewhere over a period of time, we would enable that. So I think it became a part of incentive structures. It became a part of the way we conducted business. It became a part of how we ran meetings. So monthly meetings in the SaaS business, for example, would sometimes have what we used to call we had some words for it, but the point is two categories of people. People who would raise their own hand to say, I did not live up to these values this last month. And this is where I struggled. And people would do that voluntarily. And someone kind of elected by the entire group to say, these three people lived these values, this value, and this is an example where it happened. And anyone who got both of, 3 stars here and 3 stars, and we used to call this we would celebrate this first one more, because it takes much more to be able to say, I did not do this right. And hence they had to be celebrated. And we said, what can we do to enable you to live those values better? So it really became, so someone who had 3 of these over a 6-month period, we would take them out and celebrate them actually. So there's a lot of stories around culture, which I'll probably save for after the podcast.
Super interesting. What was the hardest hire you've had to make in the history of Circles?
I would say co-founders.
Yeah.
Yeah, co-founders are the hardest hires in the sense you are committing for the long term. It's a little bit like getting married, I really actually remember discussing with my co-founders that why don't we do it this way, that any kind of wealth you might make in any part of the world, let's just split it. And I was not married, but they were, and they agreed and they went back home and their wives told them to get real. Some version of this happened, but yeah, I think finding co-founders, I think that's the hardest thing. People you can trust completely. I think this.
And let's talk a little bit about communication because, as you called out, the business has evolved over time and it's evolved in really positive ways in the long term. But I imagine that when you were making those decisions, some of them were pretty big decisions. How did you think about, did you communicate that very early on to the team? How did you go about that as you started to think about broadening the product focus into things like SaaS? What was the journey you had to go on to sort of make sure you brought people along the journey with you?
So I think fundamentally we did not see it as communicating to the team, but co-creating with the team. And hence communication a lot of the times happened by the virtue of it getting created.
Got it.
And the good thing about that was any reservations that people had about an idea came out before it became a thing. To say, we are baking your concerns into it. Of course, there were situations where you had to say, even if 90% of the people say X and the answer is not X, given what you're trying to do, you have to communicate that. And in that case, we would try not to say this is the answer, we would communicate the principle and debate the principle instead. If we debate the principle and land on the principle, the thinking was people will land on the right things. If you try to tell people exactly what to do, they're not thinking anymore. And frankly, you don't need smart people in that case. So communication became more an outcome and could be done by anybody at that point. So that's how we went about it. And that's why being principles led, whether that's your values or whether your principles for building the business, they became the focal point. Discussing those became more important. And then just communication just happened. Of course, there were people who would join afterwards, some people who would not speak in the process of making it work, and they would raise issues later. And in that case, we also had this, disagree and commit because we had the opportunity to speak.
Got it.
I think let's get a shift to fundraising, because it would be a shame to not ask you some of these questions given your background before Circles even. And we have a ton of early stage founders listening to this. So maybe what are your thought process and what like processes did you apply to that first round of capital injection into Circles, that first seed round or first angel round? Did you run a process? Were you winging it? Did you have an idea around composition or quantum of how much you wanted to, in terms of capital, what you wanted to achieve?
For the seed, I think it happened so quickly. I think we just went to people we knew and they said, here's the money. So I think we were okay. But the thinking there was we wanted to work with people we could trust. It's a double-edged sword, by the way, at that point, because you take money from people you trust and it doesn't go anywhere. The guilt and everything would be too much. And hence we put in whatever we had into the business as well, just to say, we are taking your capital, but we are doing the best we can. So I think that was one. We soon hit a snag from there, actually. The 6-7 months into it, we had a bit of an issue because on the face of it, was a telco business, right? You go talk to people, say, we are doing some telco thing. They don't listen to the entire story very often. It's like, what space is this? This is telco. Like if today you go to people and say it's AI, I think people will listen to you. But if you say telco, I assure you, even today, they will say, what telco, right? So there's a little bit of that. And we are like, oh, this guy didn't get it. It's okay. Then we had 3 more meetings. Then we had 5 more meetings. And then we were on our 25th meeting. And we were like, something is wrong here. And then we became really desperate. And I think it showed in our body language. So people would meet us and they would like us, right? And they would say, we like you as people, but why don't you run a drone delivery business? Drone delivery of SIM cards, because back then the drones were coming up, right? So if you deliver your SIM cards with drone, it'll work really well. And then I can justify it to my IC. And we're like, this is just fundamentally broken. This is not the way to do it. Like, we'll turn into something. And this is an important piece for early stage founders, since you mentioned. Being very clear on what you're trying to do and why, and having conviction on that is so important, because naysayers are many. And this is the same story with Uber, same story with Netflix. Everyone has faced this until they became successful. Airbnb, same story. I mean, they were selling Oreos or something. I think Cheerios, whatever these things are called. So we had that, and then we looked at it differently. We said, why don't we look at people who believe in the telco thing and are also frustrated? And then it came down to just 5 families in all of Southeast Asia. We met them all. And actually the second we met them all, but we took the money from the second person because he said 15 minutes into the discussion, here's $10 million. Really, it really happened that way. 15 minutes into it, actually, without naming the gentleman, he turned to his accountant and said, do I have 10 million in the bank account? And of course he had. And the accountant said, let me check. And, when you met 100 investors by that time, you actually believe that. You're like, maybe he doesn't. Then everybody laughed and it was like, okay, this is fine.
Right. And so there's obviously been an evolution since then. And you've had the luxury of quite sustainable success with Circles. You've got some very reputable investors on the cap table, the likes of Sequoia and Founders Fund. How do you think through selecting the right investors as you continue to scale and go through a more mature journey as a company?
I think it's a very, very critical question simply for the reason that investors are employees you cannot fire. And even co-founders can decide to do things differently, but investors are there forever. So in that sense, I think it's a very important question. And if you put that lens on, then the natural way to think about it would be how to find people who believe in the vision, who believe in the story, and hence being transparent with them. There's a little bit of selling that happens in the investment process, which I understand. But I think it's critical to really land with people who know everything and believe in your story and believe in you as people. Because they could believe in the story and say, well, why don't we change the team? I've heard all of these stories. And then the question is, how do you find people who believe in it? How do you test for that? How do you test for how they deal with founders? I think those are 2 major questions in my mind. When it came to what do they believe in, have they done similar kind of investments before? How long were they in those investments? How did they support those businesses? Was very important. And when it came to people, how have they decided, how did they deal with difficult situations? Right? How did they solve problems around leadership teams? Did they even coach these founders? And frankly, it's been a journey for me too, right? And I'm a very different person than I was in 2014. And all these people have coached me, they have mentored me. So do they have the time to mentor you? So I think these were some of the factors that went into it. But the flip side of it, because you'll hear really good stories, by the way, from VC firms around this is what we've done. Really good stories are the ones where they have chosen to not do something or where it went south and what were their learnings around that. Because if they're humble enough to share those things, then they're more likely to be on a journey as opposed to showing up on a pedestal too. So it's a little bit of, it's maybe the answer to the previous question should have been the most difficult hire is your investor, actually.
Let's talk about the future of Circles. So what do you think Circles Life looks like in the next, call it 5 to 10 years?
I think we're just getting started at Circles. The business is we are in 7 countries and expanding to many more. But if you go back to the original mission of the business, I think telco customers around the world could be served better. And Circles is on that mission. We have gone from being a SIM card provider to being provider of a software that can be used by telcos around the world. And the reason for building that was to give an opportunity to people we can't touch suddenly, right? We can't suddenly launch marketing campaigns in 50 countries, but you can give software to people around the world. So I think Circles is on that trajectory. We have recently launched products which are for global customers, for travelers, and it all comes from a culture of innovation. So the future of Circles is, again, continuing to innovate, but going after that mission to empower customers. I think telco is one way to enter, but we'll try a few more.
And then let's talk about the future of Abbey. So I know we kind of catch up semi-regularly, and there's a lot going on with you. You know, what's next for you? What are your aspirations? What's keeping you excited for the next 5-10 years?
You know, let's go back to the principles. Since everything is about principles. You know, the principle of dreaming big, the principle of not having frameworks defined versus first principles, the principle of allowing yourself to fail but listening to feedback, I think, and having mentors around me. I think those 3 or 4 things kind of have guided me forever, and including now as I think about the future. And I think the future of the world lies in AI. And if it's artificial intelligence, then you want to be you want to be at the epicenter of that change. One might say, so firstly, I want to build something. I want to continue building things, and I want to build it in a space which will have the most impact. And one answer could have been to do it here in this part of the world. But, and that would be conventional wisdom too. I mean, all my friends are here, my network is here, people know me, it's easier to hire. But the right thing to do is to dive into the deep end of the pool one more time. That's the right thing to do. Reestablish credibility in a completely different part of the world, because that's where the future is, as I see it. I spent 3 months in Silicon Valley last year, and it was an eye-opening experience. Just the quality of talent, the density of talent, the earnestness with which people approach problems. You know, they are very mission-driven, and it's refreshing. No one's trying to copycat anything, right? It's great. And Circles, you know, we could have been one of the copycat businesses. We were not. So it's going to be building a business in the US. The specifics will emerge very soon, but it will be there, and it's going to be a grind. So I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome.
Exciting.
Final question. If you had to part ways with any final lessons that you could provide to any founders listening right now, what would they be?
There is nothing I can say that's not been said. But I will say this, my own lesson from all of this is, I think in the short term, life can seem very tumultuous. Things can look crazy. But if you really look long term, you are moving forward more often than you can imagine. And hence, staying with a problem and staying put and persevering is more often than not the recipe for success. You stay with the problem long enough, you stay with the situation, you will succeed. I think just prevailing, I think, is a choice. So if I had to put it in one little thing, I think prevailing is a choice. It may not seem like it, it is a choice.
I'm glad we gave you that second to think. That was great.
Yeah, that was amazing. Abby, thanks so much for joining us on the first podcast.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Cheers.